fooled by Putin again? Trump's rhetoric suggests he could be. For weeks, President Donald Trump and his aides have assured he was never actually fooled by Vladimir Putin. When Trump, after years of saying warm things about the Russian president, finally did recently turn on the longtime US adversary, it had to be because Putin had somehow changed. And now, despite all those attempts to rewrite history, Trump walks into his most high-profile Putin meeting, at risk of again looking like a dupe. Granting Putin an audience on US soil was already a risk, if history was any guide, and the stakes have only risen since the announcement of the Alaska summit just a week ago, thanks to Trump himself. Ahead of Friday's meeting, Trump and the White House were initially careful to manage expectations. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt likened it to a mere listening exercise. Secretary of State Marco Rubio agreed. Trump said this was just the first meeting, suggesting a second meeting, possibly including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, would have to be earned. But by Thursday, that quickly gave way to Trump's penchant for promising the world. He twice assured he felt a deal was impending. "I think Putin does want the whole thing, and I think he has wanted the whole thing," Trump said of Ukraine on Fox News host Brian Kilmeade's radio show. "But because of a certain relationship that he has with me running this country, I believe now he's convinced that he's going to make a deal. He's going to make a deal. I think he's going to," Trump added in the Oval Office later in the day. "I think President Putin will make peace." If that sounds familiar, it's because Trump predicted much the same thing 6 months ago. "I mean, I know him very well," Trump said in February. "Yeah, I think he wants peace. I think he would tell me if he didn't. I trust him on this subject." But Putin clearly didn't want peace at that juncture, as the last 6 months have shown. And those types of comments became a problem when Trump suddenly decided to start criticizing the Russian president, apparently in frustration over his reluctance to help deliver Trump's much-promised peace deal. How could the US president really have believed Putin wanted peace, so much so that he would publicly vouch for him in that manner? If you look closely at how Trump has described his turnabout on his Russian counterpart, it looks a lot like tacit acknowledgement that he had indeed succumbed to his flattery and misjudged him. Trump repeatedly talked about how Putin said nice things but then didn't back it up with action. He at one point called it bullshit. Trump's also spoken openly about how he thought a peace deal in Ukraine would be easier. "I thought the easiest one would be this one," he said Thursday. And in perhaps the most telling instance, Trump last month recalled talking to First Lady Melania Trump about a wonderful conversation with Putin, right before she told him about Putin bombing yet another city. It sounded a lot like the president admitting Putin had dazzled him, only to quickly get a reality check. At the very least, Trump has taken very little care to avoid the perception that Putin has pulled the wool over his eyes, over many years. Which brings us to Friday. It's possible Trump has good reason to believe Putin is ready to deal. We're not privy to the behind-the-scenes machinations, and we still don't know what precisely prompted this meeting. But by Trump's new standards for dealing with Putin, words aren't supposed to be trusted. It's action to back it up that's required. Beyond that, new reporting adds to the evidence that Trump might not really know what he's dealing with. Early Thursday morning, CNN reported that Trump has been asking White House officials and Europeans what's changed about his counterpart. Many around Trump are now trying to give him the idea that Putin changed, so he has a reason to say that he wasn't wrong in his initial impression coming into office that Putin is a good guy. A person familiar with the matter told CNN. It's easy to see why this would be an attractive narrative to Trump. But the idea that he might actually buy into it wouldn't exactly speak well of his ability to read Putin and process the intricacies of diplomacy, especially given people have been trying to tell Trump for a very long time that Putin is the bad guy. Lots of Americans seem to see these same problems in their president's approach to Putin. Despite Trump's much-cultivated reputation as dealmaker, Americans have very little confidence in his ability to strike a good one here. A Pew Research Center poll released Thursday showed 59% of Americans had little or no confidence in Trump to make wise decisions about the war in Ukraine, compared to just 16% who were very confident. The rest, 24%, were only somewhat confident. When Americans were asked whether Trump favored one side or another too much, about half who offered opinions said he sided with Russia too much. The rest were mostly Republicans who said Trump had been even-handed. Previous polling has also shown that many Americans fear that even a potential deal with Russia will prove too favorable to Putin. Friday could be Trump's chance to prove those people wrong, that he can actually forge a deal, and a good one at that. but one could be forgiven for fearing a repeat of the mistakes of the past. Europeans strike upbeat note after Trump hears them out on Putin's summit demands. Since U.S. President Donald Trump announced he will meet Vladimir Putin in Alaska, European leaders have been on edge. Although Trump has lately signaled support for Ukraine, Europe fears that Putin, a former KGB spy, will be able to bring the U.S. president back round to seeing the war on his terms. Desperate to get Trump's ear one last time, European leaders on Wednesday held a virtual summit with the U.S. president, in what resembled a pre-match pep talk before he sits one-on-one with Putin on Friday. The Europeans struck a tentatively upbeat note after the meeting, claiming that Trump had been sympathetic to their calls for an immediate ceasefire, and that Ukraine must have a seat at the table in future negotiations. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said those on the call agreed on 5 common principles. First, that nothing about Ukraine should be discussed without Ukraine. Second, that preparations should begin for a joint summit of Ukraine, Russia and the US. Third, that Russia should agree to a ceasefire before peace talks begin in earnest. Fourth, that Ukraine should receive security guarantees, which Zelensky said Trump supported. Russia cannot have a veto over Ukraine's European and NATO prospects, Zelensky said, and Russia must face fresh sanctions if Putin does not agree to a ceasefire in Alaska. Peace talks must be combined with appropriate pressure on Russia, he stressed. 2 European diplomats familiar with the virtual summit told CNN that, during the call, Trump seemed to say he would push for an unconditional ceasefire in his meeting with Putin, saying he believed this would be a show of goodwill from Russia. Trump also said that the issue of Ukrainian territory is not for him to negotiate, the sources said. In his public comments, Trump, who has veered from praising Putin to pillorying him, struck a harsh tone once more, saying Russia will face very severe consequences if its president does not agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine during Friday's summit. Trump told reporters that if the summit goes well, a follow-up meeting between Putin and Zelensky could happen almost immediately afterward. There's a very good chance that we're going to have a second meeting which will be more productive than the first. Because the first is, I'm going to find out where we are, what we're doing, Trump said during an appearance at the Kennedy Center. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who convened Wednesday's call, said that the Europeans, quote, made it clear that Ukraine must be at the table for the next meeting. We want things to go in the right sequence. We want a ceasefire at the very beginning, and then a framework agreement must be drawn up, Merz said at a press conference with Zelensky. Although Trump said bluntly on Monday that, quote, there'll be some land swapping going on, Merz stressed that legal recognition of Ukrainian territory is not up for discussion. During a meeting in Moscow last week with Witkoff, Putin proposed a plan that would require Ukraine to cede the eastern Donbass region, most of which is occupied, in exchange for a ceasefire, according to U.S. officials. The exact details of the plan have been shrouded in confusion since reports of it first emerged. Threat is on. Last week, Trump had given Putin the deadline of August 8 to agree to a ceasefire or face punishing new sanctions on its shadow fleet, which has enabled Moscow to circumvent sanctions on its oil exports and finance its war. After the deadline ended without consequence, Trump announced the summit with Putin this Friday. Putin has long tried to shrug off the effect of sanctions, but Zelensky said Wednesday that the Russian leader was bluffing. Sanctions are hitting Russia's war economy hard, he said after the call with Trump. Putin can't fool anyone. A European official familiar with the call said that they got the impression the threat is on of secondary sanctions against Russia if the upcoming Alaska talks prove fruitless. It is obvious that the India sanctions had an effect, the official said, referring to Trump's pledge of issuing a 25% additional tariff on India for buying Russian oil. That tariff is expected to go into effect in the weeks ahead. Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, told CNN that Zelensky is urging Trump to use the stick he wields over Russia. The key issue is the stick that President Trump allegedly has. This could be either more economic sanctions on Russia or more military support to Ukraine, Gabuev said. That's where President Zelensky wants to be optimistic that the Russian economy is crumbling. But Ukraine is facing its own pressures, he said. This week, small groups of Russian troops pierced parts of Ukraine's increasingly porous front lines in the eastern Donetsk region, to the alarm of Ukrainian officials and military bloggers. If Russia's economy is creaking, so is Ukraine's front line, Gabuev said. The timeline here is really crucial, he added. Putin is confident that he has another 12 to 18 months, and that Ukraine doesn't have that.